Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, and the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. My guest today is Professor Christopher Berry, and we discuss how busy parish music directors can build up a solid repertoire of organ music they can play Sunday in and Sunday out at the parish, even with an otherwise very busy schedule. And we tackle some other thorny questions that organists face day to day, too. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I recommend to you Professor Berry's class on organ literature, one of our 9 graduate level courses this summer at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California. The course meets for 5 days, July 14th through the 18th, 2025, for 2 graduate credits. The course will provide students with an overview of the canon of sacred organ literature, highlighting important composers for the instrument, and developing an understanding of notable schools of composition. Special emphasis will be placed on repertoire, which grew organically from Gregorian chant, as well as the works of the most prolific composers for the instrument, Bach, Franck, Tournemire, Messiaen, etc., which find a happy home in a Catholic liturgical setting. Don't wait. The application deadline is next week, Thursday, May 1st. Visit catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org and click on summer courses. And now, on to the interview. Chris, it's so great to have you back on the program. You know, you're heading into summer again with us. We'll be team teaching the Choral Institute this summer, July 7th through the 11th at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, where we're singing Lauds, Mass, Vespers every day. And then the week after that, you're going to be teaching an organ literature class, July 14th through the 18th. And so I'm happy to have you back on the program, and we're going to talk about a topic that I think will be helpful. And if people want to learn more, they're really going to get a lot of help through that organ literature class. So thanks for being on with me today.
Thanks for having me.
So my first question is, when we're thinking about like the demands that a musician has for playing week in, week out, a music director at a parish has so many things to do. What are some of the prerequisites for how to even think about building a repertoire for weekly playing at the liturgy? And by building a weekly repertoire too, I'm thinking about like, what does that actually mean? How often do you repeat things? But to get there, let's talk first about what are some foundational things that you just have to think about before you even think about a strategy for doing it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think a really solid educational background is key. So, I mean, ideally, organ study, at the undergraduate level, at least to some extent, is necessary to prepare us in terms of having the requisite technique to churn out a lot of repertoire. Also, the requisite knowledge of the breadth of organ literature as to, what repertoire is out there, what is accessible to me, what's more of a reach for me. Also being able to, to have the experience to be able to look at a piece of music and decide how long it's going to take to learn. Enough knowledge of organ building to know whether or not that repertoire is going to work well in the instrument that I have, etc. So that's the foundational educational component. Then, in terms of, so let's assume that as a player, I have that component, or, perhaps through continuing education programs of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, I've been able to get myself up to speed and I'm ready to go with that. Now I find myself in a parish situation, and you asked about, repetition of repertoire, scheduling of repertoire. Well, then, that's when individual preferences kind of can come to the fore, but also our experience. So, I remember when I was young, I really did plan out organ repertoire for the year. So at least for the academic year, so that during the summers, I could begin practicing new pieces. And so I was really judicious about when I tried to work in new pieces for voluntaries, for preludes or postludes or pieces during the liturgy. As I progressed through that and got to know myself a little bit better and got to know more repertoire, then I don't plan that far in advance. But in so doing, in planning that far in advance and then living it out, I saw what repetition can do. And, let's face it, most listeners may not even notice when we repeat repertoire. They do, they probably don't mind. In fact, familiarity is a positive for us, I think, as organists. And we can maybe get more into that, but there's a bit of a salient issue, I guess. Building in some judicious repetition, every couple of months, repeating pieces is certainly fine. Or for instance, if there's a Bach prelude and fugue that's taken us a long time, let's say the D major prelude and fugues at BWV 532 with the famous scale, which opens the prelude. Okay, so if we've taken the time to learn that, I don't think any parishioners are going to object if we program that during the Christmas season and the Easter season. There's general pieces like that.
Yeah, I mean, the other question is too, what's the soundscape and what's the aesthetic of the liturgy, right? So like where you are right now, like you've got one sound sort of world. I often think of the biographies of composers too, like how Messiaen, when he was first titular at Holy Trinity, was always getting in trouble for how he was playing and improvising. But that's happened to every single famous organist, right? So like what are the bounds and how do you push those or stay within them?
Yeah, the sound. So I've started talking about the soundscape. So I think most of us do in our parishes have a soundscape for the liturgy. If not, we should decide what that soundscape should be. And by that, we do mean the sound aesthetic, the sound ideal, and that has to do with stylistic questions, right? So yes, for where I work right now, that soundscape is early music oriented, or or even Bach oriented, and those are of course valid and viable soundscapes. For others, there were times when I worked at Holy Trinity in New York, I would say the soundscape was Barry improvisation / Tournemire / Messiaen. And that, for me, is more of an ideal soundscape. But that's going to vary according to the individual organist, also according to the instrument at hand, according to, of course, the clergy, especially our pastor or rector, and it's going to vary according to the parishioners that we have, and so. What they are comfortable with, what edifies them, what engages them in prayer, because, this question is fraught. I mean, the last thing we want to do is turn people off from prayer. And it also, compels us to try to help educate people as to how to listen, which is, of course, key in terms of thinking about active participation, that active participation of listening.
Yeah.
And so especially how to listen to organ music, which is an art that not even all musicians, or maybe even most musicians, do not have, how to listen to organ music. And so we have some education to do there.
Before we get into like the kind of daily practice routine and build this sort of stuff, could we go on the question of how to keep a congregation prayerful, or let's say how to cultivate a prayerfulness before Mass, especially if you have a very chatty congregation? How do you do that? And I think also at the end, very famous organists have had very different approaches to this. I mean, you think about some of the improvisations at Notre Dame in Paris, like that it's very affluent and it can be contrasted with, for example, that famous story from Tournemire, where he had a guy up in the organ tribunal with him, and he was improvising at the end of Mass, and he got quiet, And the guy in that tribunal said to him, "Dear master, it's the sortie, or the exit, And he said, "Eh bien, sortez." Well, if it's the exit, then you exit, And so, like, how much volume, for example, is connected to that prayerfulness on both sides of the liturgy?
Yeah, that's such a great question. A great story of Turnemir's. He, as you well know, was so devout, and so his idea was to draw the people after Mass into a prayerful silence of thanksgiving, as opposed to a bombastic sortie or a bombastic postlude, which just turns into fancy music for people to walk out to. So that's a particular question of what to do at the end of Mass. I think volume is a key here, but this is so there are many questions that are interrelated here. So there are the theological questions, perhaps, or the ecclesiological questions about training the people as to what they should be doing before Mass. And that's a question. What do we want them doing? I mean, we don't play preludes here at St. Stanislaus because there's a rosary before Mass. There's a public recitation of the rosary. I don't know to what extent that happens in most parishes. If there's not a rosary, I would assume we want the people engaged in some sort of contemplation or meditative reading of the lections for the upcoming liturgy. So again, that entails some sort of education in as to what meditation is, what contemplation is. So what music aids that? Well, I mean, I think we can probably answer that, and that's probably not loud, bombastic, virtuosic music calling attention to the organ and or the organist, but as our dearly beloved Bill Mart, may he rest in peace, said, perhaps contrapuntal music, which functions to engage the intellect of the listener, even without him knowing that his intellect is being engaged, so that he can concentrate and begin to narrow his focus, or to bring his focus to the sacred liturgy, and also sort of rightly orders the intellect for prayer. And that maybe is the best, the contrapuntal music, or certainly some prayerful a prayerful adagio of Louis Vierne or of Turnemir or something like that. But so I mentioned the juxtaposition of all these issues, and we mentioned the ecclesiological issues or the theological issues, but then there's that educational issue of teaching people how to listen, which is involved in this. So teaching people how to listen to the organ. I think these days it's a stretch to expect that most people who aren't musicians have been taught how to listen to counterpoint. And I think it is, I don't know if you would agree, but it seems to me that it's a skill that does need to be taught for most people. There are instinctive reactions that people have to counterpoint, but it, of course, as you well know, can be taught how to listen to it, and therefore how to appreciate it, and therefore how to let it act upon one's soul, and then how to listen to the organ. So you mentioned volume. When we were playing the organ, we have so many overtones at our disposal, so many harmonics. And if I'm using language that's not familiar to the listener, again, come to some of our programming at CISM, and we'll help you along with that. But sometimes the amount of overtones that we have are just overwhelming for most listeners. It's more than a listener in a concert hall would get from a full orchestra in terms of the gamut of sounds that are heard. So we do have to be really careful about that. No matter how skillful the playing, no matter how wise the programming, sometimes the sheer volume of sound can be off-putting.
What's an interesting thing that I've done, and I'm wondering your opinion of what I've done. When you're in a situation like a wedding, where you get a lot of people coming into your parish that might not be there and might not have like a sort of steady diet of this prayerfulness and learned listening that you're talking about, but they're just visiting your parish. One of the things that I've found to be effective is if you're improvising, waiting for the bride to show up or whatever, and making sure that all the timing is correct is to build in terms of volume and then cut to almost nothing immediately after that. Because what happens so many times is that the louder the organ gets, the more people talk. But if you cut out underneath that, then they start noticing that they were being really loud and obnoxious. There's a tempering effect there, like, oh, I probably shouldn't be talking this loudly in a church, because this is not just background music, but actually something else is going on here.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing to try. I've seen that work. I've experienced that work just as you described. Frankly, I've also experienced it not work. So I've experienced like an immediate quieting down and then a building back up of the chatter as the music starts again, because it is viewed as background music. And then of course we're talking about weddings, which are a specific, sort of occasion. If we're talking about, the parish, weekend liturgy, perhaps it's different. And that sort of trick, as you say, could be done pretty effectively, and it could really give people get the point across.
Yeah, because I think probably a lot of our listeners are going to be thinking like, well, there's not a history of playing preludes and postludes at my parish, right? This is something new that I'm starting, and everybody just talks, and there's not this prayerfulness, so it has to be part of a comprehensive plan. I talk about this with the seminarians all the time. Like, you need to teach people how to really pray at Mass. And it's not something that is just natural in the culture and in the water, and the music is on that team of the pastor leading his people to worship God rightly.
Yeah, so I won't name the place. It's not the church where I currently work. Before Midnight Mass on Christmas, we instituted the Office of Readings, the sung Office of Readings, in lieu of a Christmas concert. And there were complaints that people felt like they were being forced to pray. A complaint. But I mean, this is something that seems so obvious, but obviously it's not. Yeah, that's what I mean. That people might need to be taught what they need to be doing before Mass, and I think it goes together. I don't know. I have to say, as organists, I'm not sure that we can accomplish on our own prayerful atmosphere. I think it, as you have said, it has to go. So this is an example of music being the handmaiden to the teaching of really the clergy, which has to be, from the pulpit or in some classes. What is it that we're supposed to be doing before the liturgy? This is what prayer before Mass is, etc.
And even things like, that the sacristy is not just chatty, and there's not a lot of chaos going on in the sanctuary. Or I've even seen some very edifying examples of a priest will be hearing confessions before Mass. He comes out and he prays for a few minutes. He doesn't do confessions up to the very last moment, but that, he comes out and prays for 5 minutes in the front of the church, in front of everybody, and then goes back into the sacristy and prepares for Mass. I've found that very edifying.
Yeah, I mean, we can say what we want, as musicians, but the people are most affected by the example and the teaching of their priest. There's no doubt about it. Mm-hmm. So, that particular example, which you just mentioned, is worth more than 1,000 words. That's worth everything.
Right. You're listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast, the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska, and the director of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. My guest today is Professor Christopher Berry, also a faculty member here at CISM, and we're talking about how busy parish music directors can build up a repertoire to play each and every Sunday and feast day. So let's talk now about back to kind of nuts and bolts. What should a daily practice routine look like for a parish musician?
Yeah, so we should be practicing every day. We have to practice every day. I think we know that theoretically, but we have to build it into our daily schedules like we would schedule a meeting with the pastor. And it's got to be sacrosanct like that, even to the point that hopefully we have a good enough relationship with our pastor that, when he asks to meet with us at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, if that's our practice time and it's reserved in the church, we have to say, Father, I'm sorry, I can't, that's my practice time. Just like we would say if we had a doctor's appointment, I'm sorry, I have a doctor's appointment. It's got to be held sacrosanct. We can't let it go for, almost for anything, certainly not for normal sort of daily or weekly circumstances. We have to hold on to it. And then, it's got to be, the length of it has to serve us. I mean, it's got to be, trying to legislate practice time as a teacher, I've learned, is difficult because, students need different amounts of practice time. And sometimes I have one particular student right now who does not need to be practicing a lot because of some physical issues. So actually, we're working with her to limit her practice time. But, for most people, at least an hour a day built into a work routine is probably going to suffice if we've attained a certain level of proficiency in playing. For others, it might be an hour and a half. As an organ teacher, as a keyboardist, I've learned over the years, my theory is that an hour and a half is sufficient at any one time for practice, and that then someone should take a break. So let's say an hour to an hour and a half, then maybe ends in the morning. And the morning is always the best, of course, for prayer and for practice because we're at our freshest. Then if we need some more time in the afternoon, just to maybe review what we've done, to look ahead at repertoire that's coming up, weeks in advance, that's when maybe even 30 minutes can suffice. We don't have as much attention later in the day. But if we're going to do that, that also needs to be set in stone as, say, I know most of us church musicians are not working 9 to 5, but let's just, for the example, let's just say, so 4:30 to 5 p.m. needs to be that wrap up practice time of the day. So yeah, those are the time parameters I would set.
What are some basic literature collections that every organist should have at their bench?
So it really should start and end with Bach. I mean, it doesn't end with Bach, but it should start with Bach. It could end with Bach. The Orgelbuchlein, the little organ book, is so serviceable basically for every need that we might have as organists. Bach, and I would suggest Bach chorale-based pieces. Firstly, there are many Bach chorales which are themselves based on Gregorian chants, so we can, in a sense, claim them as our own as Catholics. And I've talked before about Ed Schaefer's great book called Bach for Catholics, which you've said is from his dissertation, you think. That's a great source of information as a little book for knowing, where these chorales come from and being able to plan and incorporate them into liturgical use. So Bach, but then there are some compilations which are good. So the Parish Organist. The Parish Organist, I think, is no longer in print. I started out, one of my teachers had this wonderful thick red volume, which is a compilation of some of the volumes. This was serialized for a number of years, the Parish Organist, but this red volume is available still online. It was an Augsburg press publication, and I think is still available through Augsburg, other places as well. Has chorale-based music and some freely composed music, which is eminently serviceable. It says parish organist. It was meant for Lutheran parish organists, but it works for us as Roman Catholic organists really well. The 80 chorale preludes by German masters of the 17th and 18th centuries is a treasure trove of accessible music, which, especially if we're working with a Bachian / early music soundscape, which generally is acceptable to everyone, I've never had anyone complain about that soundscape, then that can be sort of a Bible for you. Baroque Music for Manuals is I think 6 volumes edited by S. Drummond Wolfe, and these are arrangements of instrumental pieces, many of which are recognizable immediately to listeners, and can buy friends for the organ, really make friends for the organ quite easily. And then there's a great collection from Oxford, the Oxford Service Music for Organ series. There are 3 manuals. There are 3 volumes of manuals only music, and then there are 3 volumes of manuals and pedal, and they're graded. So volume 1 being the most accessible to volume 3 being the most challenging in both of those genres, for manuals only and for with pedals. It's great to start out with those. Then if we have time, or if you want, we can get into individual composers. But
yeah, so let's talk a little bit about Bach. I mean, our good friend Aaron James, who's going to be our organist this summer at the Sacred Liturgy Summit, he did a complete Bach project this whole year. And so maybe people aren't going to be doing that, but let's say that they want to work somehow systematically through Bach. What do they do?
Well, they can come to the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music continuing education programs and learn all about Bach organ literature. Then they can also, so deciding on which edition of Bach one is going to use is can be a complicated issue, but it needn't be complicated. The NBA, the Bärenreiter edition, is I think considered by most scholars the preeminent edition, and has been considered that way for years now. The Bärenreiter edition. However, the Peters edition, is instantly recognizable with its sort of yellow and green cover and distinctive lettering. The Peters edition of the complete Bach works is really a good scholarly edition as well. It has its own merits, which are above and beyond even the Bärenreiter edition, and that the Peters edition is faithful to Bach's stemming when we still have Bach's stemmings, which are really helpful in terms of fingering, because Bach, one of the main challenges in Bach, of course, is deciding in really dense textures when the left hand is going to help out the right hand with the alto voice, and when the right hand is going to help out the left hand with the tenor voice. Okay, so Bach often stemmed those lines the way that he thought best. Peters has retained that, so it can be valuable to at least refer to Peters. And I will say, when I studied in France, and I think it's the same way, Peters was the edition that was used. So when I went for lessons with Marie-Claire Alain, I took my Peters edition. When she wanted to refer to her notes, she got out her Peters edition. So that was kind of nice to see. Also, in the Peters edition is a really well thought out grading system of all of the pieces of Bach. So I think that grading system maybe doesn't appear in every volume of the Peters edition, but it is there if you look at it in the introductory material, so that if one doesn't have a teacher, or if one hasn't studied a lot of Bach organ works, you could really refer to the Peters edition. And kind of, not that you're going to necessarily, unless you're Aaron James, learn every piece there, though maybe eventually you'll fill in the gaps, but you could pick one from the easier chorale preludes, and then the easier free compositions. And then once you've got those, go to sort of the medium level and so forth.
Right.
And that can get you going on Bach. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. It's great advice. So let's think about some Romantic era and Cecilian collections. The Cecilian movement produced so many helpful sorts of collections insofar as they were thinking about the Catholic organist and need for short versus long pieces, and pieces for the organist who has more or less training. But let's also be honest about a lot of that repertoire, that it sounds a little schmaltzy and saccharine and feels like sentimentality at prayer rather than robust prayer. And so, what are some collections that you find useful for the Catholic organist to avoid the schmaltz?
Yeah, so there are those ubiquitous Rossini volumes, right, of organ music. I think there's 6 volumes of those. I can't remember what they're called. There's definitely Sicilian volumes, and they resound with what you're talking about. There are some really good pieces in there, but then there's a lot of schmaltz as well. So one has to wade through them carefully. So I can't say that I've found Sicilian volumes per se that I recommend, but there are composers associated with that movement. Benoit is one from France. His elevations, there are 2 volumes of those elevations, which one can find pretty readily and are not expensive and are really usable. Boelman has this collection, Heures Mystiques, Les Heures Mystiques, the mystical hours. Pieces in every key, basically, they're indexed by key, so that it makes it very usable. So we have a communion chant and then a communion motet, we can see which key would work best in between those and pick something from Boelman. There is a series, the Consolieri Classic series, which one can find, Sheet Music Plus and major, Catholic music retailers, which is 6 volumes by various composers, some going back to the Sicilian movement, but also modern composers. And I think that's an underrated, right, like really great series with some really nice pieces in there and not too much schlock. Franck has L'Organist, César Franck has L'Organist, which is again arranged by key. Then also, Franck was known for large scale works, so he can be sort of daunting for liturgical players. But if we scour his works, we can find serviceable movements or parts of larger movements that work. For instance, his Grande Pièce Symphonique, which is, really perhaps the first organ symphony. So, not a genre which we connect with the church necessarily, though we probably should, but that's getting into a rabbit hole that we don't have time for now. The organ symphony probably grows out of liturgical playing for the low mass. But from his Grande Pièce Symphonique, there's an andante movement, which works really well as service music. Guillemot has the collection called L'Organiste Liturgique, and there are some good pieces in there. Alexandre Guillemot wrote an awful lot, so he's one that one does have to be careful with in terms of picking through the pieces. He wrote organ symphonies, and again, if you look through his organ symphonies, you can find movements that work, like the Adagio from the 6th Symphony, work really well. And then I'll just end it up with Louis Vierne. The 24 pieces in freestyle of Vierne are pieces that can work very well liturgically if one is careful.
Could you also share with us any modern era collections you like?
Yeah, so there's the Consoliere series, which I already mentioned, which does have some modern composers, but also Music for Sunday Morning, which is, I believe, a Morning Star publication. And it may still be in publication. There may still be new volumes of that. I'm not sure. It was published at least for a number of years, and was music by contemporary composers, really serviceable for the Catholic liturgy. So they were divided by, or they were organized by, there would be a suite, a prelude, another piece which was appropriate for maybe offertory, then communion, and postlude. So Music for a Sunday Morning, look up that series. Great composers have been represented in there. And then the Organist Companion, which is published by Wayne Leopold, has great music, historical music, but also music of modern composers, contemporary composers as well.
Great. So I'm going to put a lid on this by just talking again about your organ lit class, July 14th through the 18th, a 2-credit class at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. The course description is this. The course will provide students with an overview of the canon of sacred organ literature, highlighting important composers for the instrument, and developing an understanding of notable schools of composition. Special emphasis will be placed on repertoire, which grew organically from Gregorian chant, as well as the works of the most prolific composers for the instrument, Bach, Franck, Tournemire, Messiaen, etc., which find a happy home in a Catholic liturgical setting. Starting from a discussion of the fundamental mechanical principles of organ building and sound production, significant developments in organ technology will be discussed with an eye to better understanding the repertoire built for different instruments and the registration thereof. And discussion of methods for launching a successful organ building or renovation campaign in a parish will also be discussed. I was wondering if you could just wrap this up by saying what your goal for a student in this summer's first instance of this organ literature class that we've offered here at CISM is.
Yeah, using as a basis the Laukvik book, and we can give specific information about that later when it's necessary. It's important for Catholic organists to have a knowledge of the breadth of the literature and to play the literature stylistically correctly. And Laukvik takes us through that, from early music. And so, we need to know, of course, about the instruments. So the sound palette that was available, at least a basic knowledge of how the instruments were constructed, because that informs us as to how to register. We also need to know the early fingering patterns and how the early players organized, measures metrically, so on and so on, through the Romantic period, certainly, through to the modern period, knowing the instruments. So learning how to register, and then, the fingering and the stylistic tendencies, the stylistic properties appropriate to that literature, so that we can, as Catholic organists, perform this literature faithfully, so that we are not only prayerful musicians, but we are really consummate, competent musicians, so that we're beyond reproach musically, so that any organist, any musician who would listen to us would say, one should really take Catholic music seriously, because that organist really knows what he or she is doing. I can tell by the way that Bach is being articulated. I could tell by the way that trio sonata was registered, or that French classic music was registered. And, even though our parishioners may not necessarily critique us if we don't register a grand jeu of Louis or Francois Couperin correctly, however, if we do it correctly, it makes the music sing and thus speak to the listener in the way that the composer intended, and in a much better way than if we haphazardly register or finger the music. So, this class is meant to make us competent, professional organists with the knowledge and the capabilities to create the most beautiful, prayerful experiences in our parishes that we possibly can.
That's great. So if you are interested in learning more about this, visit our website at catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org and click on summer classes, July 14th through the 18th, organ literature with Professor Christopher Berry. Thanks so much for joining me today, Chris.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.